Taoiseach, Mara Heaney and the Heaney family, distinguished guests, fellow panellists, ladies and gentlemen, it is a singular honour, and for once these words do not constitute diplomatic rhubarb, to be asked to open proceedings at the 34th Annual McGill Summer School and Arts Week at Glen Tees. If it's not presumptuous to do so, may I extend a Cade Miller Fulcher to everyone, and that's not a bid to become the next Minister for the Gaeltacht. I'm delighted to be in Donegal on an auspicious day for Gaelic football for this county. On an earlier visit, I had the chance to put my hands on the Sam Maguire Trophy. Joe McHugh was proudly showing it off to the British-Irish Parliamentary Assembly. Donegal had, of course, one old Sam that year. So I hope, for those of you who don't mind this hope, that that's a good omen. Naturally, my Gaelic football sympathies lie with Sam Maguire's old team, London. The overall political theme for the week, without fundamental reform of our politics and institutions, can we meet the challenges ahead, is an excellent one. I will leave others to comment on the desirability or otherwise of reform in Ireland. But the British government is in no doubt at all of the need for reform of politics and institutions at the European level, of which more later. Now, it is nearly a year since the sad death of Seamus Heaney, so it's fitting that the McGill Summer School should pay tribute to that great intellectual and poet whose roots were dug deep into Ulster's soil. We're still digging to find the right words to capture Seamus Heaney's legacy, which goes well beyond beautiful poetry and liberating translations such as Beowulf, into a realm where his generosity of spirit, his honesty and compassion continue from beyond the grave to inspire us to try a bit harder. When he won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1995, the Nobel Committee described his poetry as works of lyrical beauty and ethical depth, which exalt everyday miracles and the living past. That's not a bad place to start. Now, I hope it won't be thought unseemly to recall Seamus Heaney's objection in 1982 to being included in a collection of British poetry. His famous riposte included these words, "Be advised, my passport's green, no glass of ours was ever raised to toast the Queen." Now, I have a photograph in my residence of the dinner given nearly 30 years later by the then President of Ireland, Mary McAleese, for Her Majesty the Queen at Dublin Castle in May 2011. And at the top table, sitting a few places from Her Majesty, is one Seamus Heaney. Now, as we all know, the Queen's visit was a huge success, transforming British-Irish relations for the better. The prominent presence of Ireland's then greatest living poet at the state banquet says something important about the respect for Seamus Heaney in both our countries and about our shared enjoyment of great Irish and British writers. Seamus Heaney's influence and following in Britain should not be underestimated. Apparently, in 2008, according to the Poetry Foundation, 2/3 of all the poetry collections sold in the United Kingdom were Seamus Heaney titles. There can't be a British child born after 1980 who hasn't studied Seamus Heaney's work at school. And, as you may have noticed, this April, at the banquet in St George's Hall at Windsor Castle for President Higgins's state visit to Britain, the Queen, in her speech, expressed her sadness at Seamus Heaney's passing, and it proved to be a remarkable moment of symmetry with the Dublin Castle banquet. During that most solemn and formal act of friendship and reconciliation between our two countries, as the Queen was speaking at the state banquet at Windsor, the spirit of Seamus Heaney entered the hall. I'm sure he was smiling down upon us, wishing us well, and noticing who else was raising a glass to toast the Queen. Ladies and gentlemen, the political scientist from Mars observing our archipelago from outer space would be struck, I think, by the constitutional turbulence across these islands. Most urgently, he would note the referendum in Scotland on the 18th of September. Would the union between Scotland and England, Wales and Northern Ireland, which has generally served the British people well, survive its close encounter with direct democracy? Well, we shall find out soon enough. Even if the Better Together campaign wins, as the British government fervently wish, and as the polls suggest, it is very likely that the Scottish government will anyway get greater powers. We don't know exactly how far Devo Max will extend, but I expect that Scots, for most intents and purposes, will become masters in their own house while enjoying the wider economic and security benefits that the Union brings. At the same time, we can expect greater devolution in Scotland to promote calls for the transfer of more powers to the devolved governments of Wales and Northern Ireland. How far that process goes, and whether it includes the devolution of the power to set corporation tax rates, can only at this stage be guessed at. Separately, we have to find a way to help the politicians in Northern Ireland operate the devolved system they already have. They need to make the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement work in the interests of the prosperity, welfare and security of the people of Northern Ireland. There is no alternative. This British government and any conceivable successor will stand foursquare behind the Good Friday Agreement's political institutions. Now, part of the answer is to encourage the parties in Northern Ireland to find solutions to the issues which reinforce the identity politics of the province and poison the atmosphere: flags, emblems, parades, and dealing with the past. Now, the British government does not believe we should impose the remedies on the parties. The local politicians need to own the solutions if they are going to stick. But a bottom-up approach should not be confused with a hands-off approach. Our sleeves are rolled up, and together with the government in Dublin, we will do what it takes to keep the parties engaged in working through these very complicated issues. In the Republic, meanwhile, the Constitutional Convention has completed its work, and the country awaits the government's response to the Convention's recommendations, to say nothing about the deliberations at this summer school and in other fora in Ireland about the desirability or otherwise of wider political reform. So there is plenty of change, of swirling change, in the system. At the same time, there's also a constant. Changes are only taking place on the basis of consent. The United Kingdom is now clearly a union based on consent. People in Scotland will decide that country's future. The Downing Street Declaration of 1993 made clear that the British government had no selfish strategic or economic interest in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland's future as part of the United Kingdom or as part of a united island of Ireland is for its people to decide. When regional government for North East England was put to a referendum in 2004, 79% of the population voted against it. Plans for 2 further referendums for regional government in Northern England were then abandoned. The principle of consent also applies to Britain's membership of the European Union. As David Cameron has observed, consent for Britain's membership is now only wafer thin. The opinion polls suggest only a small margin of British voters wish to remain in the European Union, and often the gap is within the margin of error. Now, why should this state of affairs have come about? I believe it's lazy thinking to blame the British press. There are plenty of Eurosceptic journalists in other countries, and British journalists are not notably more dishonest than those in other countries when addressing serious issues. The reason is more fundamental. In just about every other member state, membership of the European Union is a guarantee of something existential. For the original 6 member states, the deep fear of another major European conflict fought over their territory means that faith in the European project is almost unshakable. For Spain, Portugal and Greece, the EU has been their salvation from and safeguard against the return to a fascist past. For the Central Europeans, the European Union protects their young democracies and prevents them falling back towards command economies and intolerant one-party politics, and helps keep Russia's baleful influence at bay. For Ireland, European Union membership has been key to the country's modernisation and remains crucial to a mature, friendly relationship with Britain. But the European Union does not have the same existential importance for Britain. Our political institutions survived the 2 world wars and emerged, if anything, stronger for having been tested in the fire of global conflict. The European Union did not modernise us. It does not guarantee our democracy. If anything, it slightly dilutes it. We were never occupied, so our fear of another European conflict is less visceral. And going back further, for most of Britain's recent history, we did our best to avoid getting entangled in the affairs of the continent, so that we could get on with trading and then building and maintaining an empire. So an arm's-length approach to the politics of Europe is, to some extent, in our national DNA. So in Britain, you do find an inherent exceptionalism. The European Union has to prove itself on more prosaic grounds. Is it providing greater opportunities for business? What benefits do individuals get from membership? Without an overriding existential need to belong to the European Union, the pros and cons of membership appear to be more in balance to many British people. For those of us who strongly believe that Britain's place is in Europe, this is all very worrying. But it's no use our thinking that because we believe we know best, we should just plough on and ignore the naysayers. That is not the spirit of our age, and that is not the politics of consent. The British government must respect and respond to the British people's views. And by the way, this phenomenon, this diminishing faith in the Union and its institutions, is by no means unique to the United Kingdom, as much as some people might wish to paint it as such. Recent European Parliament elections and the Eurobarometer polling have shown huge discontent across the continent, from France to Finland, and to some extent here in Ireland too. So whilst the UK's disillusion may be at a more advanced stage, this issue is something that no member state can afford to ignore. The new British Foreign Secretary, Philip Hammond, defines himself as a pragmatist and a realist on Europe. He's committed to advancing the changes the British people want to see through hard-headed, practical engagement, so that we can achieve a new settlement in the European Union that can command the British people's consent. And the encouraging thing is that British opinion polls record comfortable majorities in favour of our European Union membership if reform has been achieved. Now, the changes we seek build on David Cameron's speech made at Bloomberg's London headquarters in January last year. Essentially, these are reforms that we believe benefit the European Union as a whole and not just the United Kingdom. And they include action in the following 5 areas. Firstly, improving Europeans or Europe's competitiveness by widening and deepening the single market and forging new international trade deals. As the German Chancellor has pointed out, a situation where Europe represents 7% of the world's population and 25% of world GDP, but pays out 50% of all social spending, is not sustainable. Concluding the transatlantic trade and investment partnership with the United States would make a big positive impact in this area. Secondly, we must take steps to prevent immigrants shopping around the member states to obtain more generous welfare benefits. In the longer term, we would like a wider discussion in the European Union about the conditions under which the principle of the free movement of workers would apply to new member states. But no one should be under any misconception. The British government does not question the fundamental right of free movement in any way. Thirdly, We should ensure that those member states that use the euro and those that don't, both groups should retain influence in making up the rules that govern the single market. It would be unfair for those not using the euro to find that the euro countries could form a bloc able to force through new measures regardless of the views of others. A bit technical perhaps, but very important. Fourthly, we must make a reality of the principle of subsidiarity. Power should flow in both directions between Brussels and the capitals of member states. As the Dutch Parliament said, we should act at the national level whenever possible and at the European level only when necessary. And fifthly, we must boost the democratic legitimacy of decisions taken by the European Union by giving national parliaments, where our citizens actually exercise democratic control, a greater role. We don't believe that transferring more power to the European Parliament makes the European Union more democratic in practice. The European Parliament is too remote from the day-to-day lives of our citizens, which is not to say that the European Parliament doesn't do important work, nor that MEPs don't work hard and are conscientious individuals. So it is against that background that one can see why David Cameron strongly opposed the process that led to Jean-Claude Juncker's nomination as the next President of the Commission. Apart from some voters in Germany, Austria and Luxembourg, very few, if any, of the European electorate understood the so-called Spitzenkandidaten process. The gap between the citizen and the top people in Brussels got a lot wider because of the manner of Mr. Juncker's appointment. Now, the UK has to live with that outcome, and we will work with Mr. Juncker, but the task of persuading the British people that the European Union is moving in the right direction has become more difficult. Before you conclude that the United Kingdom is heading inexorably for the so-called Brexit door, let me finish on an upbeat note. As I said, the polls in Britain consistently show a strong majority in support of staying in a reformed Europe. The sort of reforms we wish to see ought to command wide support across member states. They are not changes only for the UK's benefit. And we're very conscious of the shock to relations on these islands that Britain's leaving the European Union would produce. But the principle of consent means that the risk is not negligible. The task is to persuade the public that the European Union can do better for them than it is doing now, and that will require reform. Reform to make the institutions more accountable to the people, so less influence for a remote European Parliament and more for national parliaments to which people relate. Reform to make the European Union a better place for jobs, business and economic growth, so that the irreversible forces of globalization do not erode our standards of living. Reform to ensure that a more diverse Europe exists in future, with some countries not integrating as much as others, and make sure that is fair to all member states. Reform to make it clear that the European project is not a one-way street, with power only travelling away from national governments to Brussels, but one where power is exercised at the right level to be effective and democratically accountable. These reforms are not pie in the sky. They will make the European Union work better for its citizens. They are the key to keeping Britain in the club. They should thus provide a win-win outcome. But to repeat myself, like all the constitutional changes taking place across our islands, the decision as to whether Britain stays or leaves will ultimately have to go with the grain of the wishes of the people. Thank goodness, these days, as we face so many constitutional forks in the road, there is no alternative to deciding which route to take other than on the principle of consent. I wish every success to all those participating in this year's McGill Summer School. Thank you very much indeed.